So, should we turn off the fan or leave it on? It's really hot in this room, but the fan's really loud. What's the vote? We'll ask Lorraine, actually. You're the honored guest. That could be a compromise. Yeah, that could be a compromise. How do you feel about that? Much better. Whew. All right, so I hope you had a long, great weekend and you're going to wind up nicely. And thank you for coming here to see and hear Lorraine Wild speak. She's one of our candidates for the Design Media Arts position, and we're actually really pleased that she decided to apply because she is actually a very well-known personality here in Los Angeles in particular. She has been living and teaching and working in LA as a professional designer for the last 20 years. She was the director of the CalArts graphic design program from 85 to 91. And then 91 to 98, she was the project tutor at the Jan Buik Academy in Maastricht in the Netherlands. At the same time, she was founding, together with other members, the pretty infamous Reverb design company that I'm sure all of you are aware of. And in 1996, in the midst of all this, she was establishing her own design practice, and this is what we like in particular. It focuses on collaborations with architects, curators, and publishers from this country and from abroad. She also has a whole slew of awards and nominations that I'll just mention some of. She was one of the finalists for the Communication Design Award of the National Design Awards sponsored by the Smithsonian. In the same year, she was awarded a gold medal by the New York Art Directors Club. And in the spring of '98, the San Francisco MoMA had a show called Lorraine Wild Selections from the Permanent Collection. So that means you're in the Permanent Collection. And then Best Books of the Year, and named the ID one of the 40 best, and so on and so on. It's a really wonderful list that I just don't want to take away from your time going on and on. We are impressed, trust me. Just one last detail. She received her BFA from the Cranbrook Academy of Art and MFA from Yale. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Okay. I'm sorry, as I realize I just... Thank you very much. I always feel like when I'm introduced and people go through the awards, I have to say, but I work in my garage in Los Angeles. Every day I get up, I go to the garage, and you know, to me, the issue of all this is the you know, the process of working, the process of solving problems, and what it takes to just get through this this interesting world we live in. I want us to. I'm kind of sorry. I'm flummoxed by the thing here. Whoops. Wait. Oh. Okay. And will you be the person to run back and switch the tray? Okay. Okay, thanks. I don't have to hold this thing. I had emailed this to Rashan for my announcement of my talk, and I'm not sure if it got on or not.
It's on.
It's on, but then she told me she dropped the caption, and the caption is critical because it's some old movie still, which of course now I can't remember the name of, but I always use it as the illustration to the old shibboleth, which is always attributed to Moholy Nagy, that says, you know, if you can't describe your idea over the telephone, you don't have an idea. And so I just wanted to start that out because the other thing I think that's interesting about that issue, of course, and which has always shocked me about that phrase, whether it truly is Moholy's invention or not, is this issue of the idea of design still being something that should be able to be described and not necessarily about the kind of picky detailing of form at the same time, you know, this is in such contrast to the way that there is a whole lot of picky detailing about form that is entailed in design. I'm fascinated also, so to me, I mean, another thing I had sent Roshan was the fact that I wanted to call the talk when she was asking me for a lecture, you know, the design as a noun versus design as a verb, and just to say that I think in the entire period of my practice, I've always been dealing with this conundrum that it's both a process and then in the end a thing, you know, so that I'm very conscious of participating in a process, but in the end having to still make a thing. And I'm attracted, both parts of that, both interpretations of design as a noun and a verb, to me are very fascinating. I mean, it's really interesting to me that after all these years, and I don't feel that old, but I feel like my entire career I've been hearing people say, oh, the public's starting to, you know, understand design, they understand design, and yet still I feel like it's a kind of flimsy, a flimsy understanding. And I think the big problems in a way are both that the pop culture definition of design is really driven by both fashion and maybe interiors, you know, and so that both fashion interiors, while, you know, they're fantastic and interesting to look at, when you think of the way they're documented in the public, the way you never actually see the process. You know, you see the pictures of the models on the catwalk, that's the final thing. You see the perfect interior shot in an architectural magazine, that's the final thing. But the whole issue of the actual process of getting there is still somewhat mystified, and as a result we have this weird aspect of the, you know, some designers being celebrities, but a kind of fuzziness about how it's actually done. I mean, even in this morning's New York Times, there's a big piece about Marc Jacob, the fashion designer, and the author of the article says, oh my God, he doesn't work alone. You know, it's like such a strange misunderstanding of, again, this like old issue of the genius whose, you know, ideas leap out of their head and then somehow everything gets realized, and who knows how. When I did do this teaching in Holland, actually at a school that ran their grad program in English because they had students from all over Europe, one of the things I was fascinated by was how the Dutch had actually 2 words for design. And I think it's true in German also, I'm not sure. In Dutch, one is called Antwerpen and the other is called vormgeving. And Antwerpen is planning and vormgeving is form giving. And so there's this very clear thing about the process is kind of parsed out. And to me, it always clarified that two-sided nature of graphic design practice. Anyway, all of this is a lengthy introduction to just say that as I'm going to show you work today, and I'm going to show you mostly work from my own practice, but a little bit a student project from this year, and I want to talk about teaching and all that this issue again of the tension between the collaboration and the nature of the way you put a project together versus what you actually get is always in play. Now, is that focused? Oh, I'm going to have to focus every single one. No?
Do you need help with that?
Well, you know, I would love it if somebody could just do the focusing thing, except then I can't. Wait a minute. See, I can't stop it. There, that's fine. The first thing I wanted to do was just show you a set of 3 books. I'm going to zip through these. I've done actually 3 big books with Tom Main and Morphosis that have documented that architectural practice. And the first one I did was and we just for shorthand's sake call them Morphosis 1, 2, and 3. The first one, I think I started with him in 1986. And it's simply a portfolio of the work that he and Michael Rotundi had done, you know, from the 70s up until the mid-1980s. Most of it was built. They had done mostly photographic documentation. One of the things that fascinated me when I started working with them is I realized that they would actually build a thing and then they'd go back and build models of it to try to analyze what they did. And so when I walked into their office, there was a lot of photographs and kind of very rich elaboration of their design. And there wasn't a lot to say about the projects. There was, but definitely you had to kind of see and understand the composition the buildings to sort of understand the tectonics of what they were going after. And actually, Morphosis 1, I think, is a real product of the mid-1980s. It's a very simple layout. There's almost no words. It's kind of, oh God, no, this is driving me crazy.
It's hard to see. It's not projectors inside.
Is there another one that I could share?
No, wait, whoa.
Collaboration. You can zip through them,
Oh.
and I'll do the focus. So just pass it to me.
Okay. Okay, but then I have to forward through here. This, actually, when I look at this book now, I have to say, I mean, I was trained in using standard grids and in a way setting book pages up very architectonically. And so what I did in order to emphasize, we can't do this. We've got to set it up differently. Stop.
It's very distracting.
Yeah.
How about the idea to bring this machine in front?
Yeah. It's really hard to do this.
Let's try it now. Because
Oh, that might be
oops.
Really, the projector's on autofocus? It's not working then, because it's...
No, just pull it off and make it right here.
Sorry.
We may have to bring the slide projector out.
But we can't do this for every image.
Right. That's,
We'll be here till 5 o'clock. It won't be pretty.
how is that now?
Well, are you pressing the button every time?
Yeah. No, it autofocus.
Oh, so it's autofocusing? Okay, so I just have to be careful. All right. And if I hit the wrong button. Anyway, as I was saying, when I look at this book now, and to me this book actually looks very conservative and a real product of the 90s, but at the time it was considered radical, and I think it was just because instead of filling the page with a grid of photographs, I was actually using the negative space to enable you to actually see into the spaces and also juxtaposing photographs in a way that emphasized their interiors. So, but again, I would say that there was also very, it's working now, I also did this project in a conventional manner of the time, and this is pre-digital, so I have to say that, the photographs were all given to me, the text was organized, I had the type set by typesetter, then it had a kind of distancing, and I think that now when you look at books created in this period right before the digital technology started to affect production of design, you can kind of see a stiffening, even for people like myself who are really chafing against the strictures of a grid and trying to empty out pages and force various issues of how you read and how narratives were created. So then the next book, which I want to say we probably started. It's funny because every time I did a book with Tom, he said, okay, that was so awful, we'll wait 10 years to do the next one. And then about 2 weeks later, when it came to Hennessy and Ingalls, he said, okay, I'm ready, let's do the next one. So this one came out, it says 92, it maybe came out in 94. Now, the interesting thing about this book is, well, there are two. Again, I'm really talking about how form here mirrors process or changes in process. The office of Morphosis was not digital yet. The architects were still working in analog, but graphic designers we had started working in Quark. We were working on the machine in this period. We had shifted essentially to digital production. Graphic designers did that before architects because the software was more flexible and mutable for typesetting. The other kind of interesting thing is this is the Recession Book because in fact, Morphosis had done like 24 projects in this period, only 4 of them built. So, you know, here was all this work. How do you explain it? What do you make the book about? Well, now suddenly, as the designer, you know, in some part because of doing a previous book successfully, but also because of the way the process had changed, now, you know, we're saying to them, well, here's how you should put this book together. And what we came up with was the idea that all the preparatory materials, you know, the sketches and the kind of low-tech models, the sort of balsa studies and things like that, would be printed on vellum, basically on translucent paper, and then photographs of as the projects get more developed and in a few cases built, then we print on regular paper. And then the other thing, and this is kind of an interesting kind of design philosophy, is that suddenly, you know, Tom had a lot more to say about the projects, and maybe this is in inversion to the amount of building actually done, but also I think it's at a time when architects, when the issue of the rhetoric and the way you describe projects became more sophisticated, but also because of all this work being unbuilt, the decision was that we would just run the text as a running narrative. Like, so there's a story that cuts through this entire book that isn't necessarily connected to what you're seeing on the page. You know, he's talking, each time he shifts talking about a building, there's a little subhead. But basically, this is, again, a kind of silent book, or it's almost a silent movie, but it's all of the parts. And in some cases, like that could be a page from Morphosis 1. But then you have this issue of using the materiality. And a lot of that, I have to say, was because we were able to mock it up more, you know, easily because of using digital production. There's a kind of level of complexity of interrelationships that we could plan out that honestly in the old days before digital, we could not have done. Like we were able to print this out in our own office on vellum and see it, you know, whereas you couldn't have done that. So this book is a kind of interesting hybrid. We also did things that are insane. Well, this, you know, the idea of printing on different papers, of course, made the publisher go crazy. And although it worked.
How many different papers? You have this vellum paper and the normal paper?
Actually, it's just vellum and normal paper, but the vellum is broken up into lots of little sections because every time in 24 projects, we had a section of like 8 pages of vellum, and that's still to this day you have to get a printer who is happy to sew it all together. So even no matter how sophisticated you are, you still in the end have, it's an issue of thread. So the other thing I want to point out, and this is when I say we were nuts, and this had to do with kind of, you know, sort of playing with the technology, is that if you look on that paragraph, and that's part of this running narrative, suddenly you see the type getting thicker as it crosses the vertical piece of the building. Well, the text type it's all set in grotesque, but it is all affected. There are these like lines of force that are aligned with the photographs where we shift the type, so it literally looks like the buildings are forcing a change in the type. So, and I would say that that too is a sign of us beginning to think of typography not as something incredibly Gumby-like, you know, flexible, of being subject to forces, but of course only being able to realize it digitally. Why it was insane is because at that point, actually Cork wasn't sophisticated enough to really do it, and we had to make pictures of type and split them in. There's only 25 pages of type in this book, and it took us like 200 hours to set it. It was so insane, but we wanted to, again, test out what the machinery can do. And that's, again, why I think this is such a fascinating, here you see, again, the kind of type rippling, sort of echoing the line of force from that detail from the ceiling of a clothing store. So this was all a test, in a way, of what we could, of just how flexible we could make the typography become. And then this is the third one, which again is dated 97. I think it came out in 99. And this marks a critical change because at this point, Morphosis had entirely shifted to digital production. There was no more model making, no more hand drawing. I mean, there's a little tiny bit of hand drawing that basically from Tom Main, but everything else turns into digital production. And of course, they were so stoked by this new condition in their office that when Tom approached me on this book, he said, look, we have this idea. We want to do one big CAD drawing. And in the end, he said, we want to just make one large rendering and put all our projects together in one line. And actually what this book is a 250-page drawing. You know, it's 8.5 by 11. It is one long CAD rendering made up of about 4 different programs that we then had to import into, you know, printing output program. That then we took, actually when I say we, what I did is I sort of camped out in their office along with an assistant, and then what we did is then we worked on top of their drawing. And I can't waste our time going into how difficult it is to print this sort of thing, but basically the fascinating thing to me about this book, and this is like a sample, there are about 24 projects. This is a sample of the beginning because it really is an extrusion that runs horizontally. And so we mark it when it starts with a big number and with typography sitting on top of the drawing. But the fascinating thing about this is, at least to my mind, although it was horizontal instead of vertical, the book is actually a scroll. You know, and it is akin to scrolling through a computer where, on a website where you don't know the end, you know, the dimension of the document is not finite. And I would say that this is a very, you know, again, this is kind of this interesting interrelationship of design for digital media affecting print design, or, you know, at least when you allow it to, you come up with these new conditions that are kind of fascinating. Although the one thing that I thought was really interesting about this was Tom insisted, this drove Rizzoli even crazier, insisted on no page numbers, but in fact we've measured the drawing by meters. You can see these little tick marks which aren't focused very well. It's measured by meters, so, you know, however many miles long it is. And everything in the back, when you get to the end of this 250-page extrusion, and it goes on and on like this, and the tick marks are sort of markers for references later in the book. Then we shift. There's this sort of interesting and strange vellum section that compares the relative footprints of all the projects. And then we shifted deliberately, or I felt deliberately, into a kind of almost antique way of setting out his text and his writings about the project, because we had created a document that was so bizarre in a way visually that we felt that the appendices in the back would then become like, not manifestos, but just very strong and clear statements. However, every reference into the drawing actually refers you to a location along the meters. And again, to me, that was very interesting, because I realized that the architect was still thinking about space in a very physical sense. The designer was thinking about it as as a kind of infinite site, you know, that we had two different constructs. But to me, it's a really interesting document in terms, this is how, the back is just in black and white. This was about a project visit he did to Sarajevo. This is a kind of timeline sequence of their projects that is just simple running type. Again, all emphasizing a kind of horizontal, what I wouldn't call a drift, there's sort of more velocity to it than that. And then it finally ends with a very, very long panoramic photo of the interior of the office with everybody in it, every computer given a name, every participant in the process basically identified. Again, I wanted to show you that sequence of books just to show the kind of shifts of the ways of thinking about design, and how, even in my period of practice, which hasn't been all that long, how radically the way that you think about design and what you can actually do with it is affected. I just wanted to kind of stop here and break to just talk about the things that I think are, the sort of principles of design that are really kind of affect my thinking about my practice and what I do. One is just the issue of starting first, the heart of everything being the content and the interest These aren't actually things I did. This is a poster by friends of mine in Holland for a dance project called Let's Start a Magazine. But the issue of constantly, again, grappling with an idea and developing form that has conceptual integrity to it. The interest in structure, to me, both understanding the conventional conventions and traditions of a kind of 20th century vernacular that we live in, that to me is kind of represented by the three-dimensional grid, but at the same time, again, understanding that those structures and proportions are a result of technologies and industrial processes that your position in relationship to them is mutable. Yeah?
Have you begun to incorporate Maya in your design?
In my design? No. No, because it's kind of over, what would be the overpowered for print, mostly. The issue of collaboration, I think, is so fascinating, and the reason I wanted to illustrate it just with this old, very, very old image of a movie set is that, in part, I think, because of the shift to digital production and especially the way that designers have been brought into design for the web or motion graphics, that, I think the issue of design as a collaborative process has been very well established. I do think that the issue of where designers stand in that process and how much credence the actual design, again, the formal outcome of the design process is given is a kind of interesting one and up for grabs. And I think that the film analogy is always a kind of complicated one, because if you read film theory or film history, you realize that everybody below the director is kind of uncredited. I mean, their name rolls very quickly through it. But to me, it's a kind of problematic construct to depend on, especially if you're used to this sort of old style authorship that at least graphic designers in the last 25 years have been encouraged to develop. Obviously, the other thing I think that is most fascinating about working right now is, especially for me working in Los Angeles, is the kind of the obvious multicultural character of our place, and the fact that all of the ways that I was taught design, or a kind of correct design where, for instance, universal symbols were supposed to be adequate communicative devices, clearly is sort of out of it. And the other thing, and this is one of I make these ridiculous charts. This is my chart that I call the Great Tao of Style, meaning that instead of, again, a kind of process that goes back to my design education where we were taught that there was such a thing as good design or good form, that I feel now that we were always somewhere on a continuum or a circle of form sort of being provocative, being interesting, and then being adapted. And certainly now with the sort of engines of branding and marketing being as high-powered as they are, sort of overdone, and then things fall out of favor, and that we're always somewhere on that cycle. So, again, a kind of correct position for the designer, I think, is a difficult one. The other part, and this is, of course, a photograph of Ray Eames staring at something. And the reason this image has kind of struck me is that there's actually always, it refers to me to that part of design practice that says that ideas in the end are developed visual, or they're delivered visually, and that it demands the development of something called your eye, which of course is very mysterious when you're just starting out as a younger designer, and that it's some kind of, some kind of recipe between your imagination and then what you developed through seeing, and that this is a process that really comes through the repetitive solving of problems over and over, and the kind of personal vocabulary that you end up bringing to your projects. So this, I think this is a much more a kind of ineffable thing, but which is actually related not only to, I think, very old, what's the word I'm looking for? examples of craft, where you learn, like say calligraphy, where the only way you become a master calligrapher is through the repeated practice of getting one's hand and eye to do the thing, together in a way that you want. Or, on the other hand, learning how to skateboard, where you see somebody out on the sidewalk doing the same damn thing 25,000 times until they get it right. It's the same, a kind of building of a personal vocabulary of both movement and thought simultaneously. And then finally, the end, of course, is this, not a cloud, but this giant new condition of the technology, of how everything in the way that design is practiced is different now, and that the great thing is that, of course, it has allowed all these new, there's a kind of level of complexity of sort of conceptual interrelationship that you can create with your work. At the same time, it's the very thing that has brought up these, I would say, challenges to the issue of authorship or even final control of your work, certainly if you're working in electronic media. Yes, this antique slide here.
Do you know where, let's say, this is come from and who is making it?
Who was the designer of that?
No idea. I mean, all these catalogs, they look exactly the same. How do you know how it is?
No, but what a good question that is, because you're right. They've got their own genre, and there isn't, like, you don't get
stereotype.
Yeah, and also there isn't really another product. I mean, like, say if you get an office supply catalog, it doesn't exactly look like that. I mean, there is a visual cliche already about what these, electronic equipment things look like, and it's always energetic, to say the least. I wanted to shift to talking about a project that I did with, that has a cast of thousands, actually, talk about the collaborative method. And I'm essentially the, quote, art director, unquote, of this book. This book, as you may or may not know, is a collaboration that was driven by Richard Koshalik, who's the president of Art Center, Tom Main, who teaches in the architecture school here. And it started with Tom and Richard thinking up a UCLA architecture student studio where they were going to do projects about downtown. And in fact, originally it was supposed to be timed in time for the race for the mayor's election, so that they could have public symposia to put design on the table in the election. It didn't happen, but it didn't happen in time. Right, exactly. Which might have been predicted given that 500 people worked on this. But anyway, what Tom did, and I thought that it was a pretty interesting thing, is that when he started with his students here, he said, well, before we start designing for downtown, let's try to understand downtown. And so they started to collect information and data, and from all sorts of sources, from the 1990 census, from what could be pulled out of the 2000 census, and then 1,000 websites. And the students had done this, and they'd kind of created a book, which was pretty unreadable and actually also unpublishable because most of it was just lifted off the web. So then Tom came to me and said, do you want to design this? And I said, oh my God, no. But then I thought for about a minute, and I said, but wait a minute, Cal Arts students should design this. And then when that, I worked that out, and so then Richard Koshalik stepped in and said, and Art Center students should take the pictures. So we had this kind of, great big giant three-pronged effort. And of course, all of this was cooked up before anybody had sat down and realized we were all on different academic calendars, which is part of the reason why it didn't happen when it was supposed to. In fact, the photos were taken last. In all the process, the photos were the last thing to be done, which was very, very strange. But anyway, I thought the kind of interesting thing about this was that it posed a kind of classic problem where we had to be very pragmatic because we really were down to like 3 months to produce this book. So we had to deal very strategically with a design. And then we had to really set up, again, a structure and a systems. We had to think about the systems first. And in fact, in my CalArt studio, what we did is we took magazines that exist. We sort of did x-rays of the structures that are set up by both in, looking at printed, again, journals that are put together quickly. We looked at a lot of websites. We looked at all kinds of things to understand that it wasn't, again, the look on the top of the thing that was going to be important, but it was going to be the mechanism that we created to plug information in. So at the same time, so in other words, we were looking for a kind of buried universal that then could be kind of customized on the top. We looked at the uses of maps, and it's interesting because in the last few years in the graphic design profession, there's been this whole set of people, and it's partly been because of the interrelationship of graphic designers into, say, big companies like Viant or Scient, or the companies that were actually doing design for the web, where they renamed their practice information architecture. And so there's been a lot of work about that, and information architecture is a term that some people accept and some people think is very bogus. But nevertheless, we looked at a lot of that work by people who call themselves information architects because we felt that in a way that's what this problem was about. The other thing, though, is that we had this kind of ghost chasing us, which was the ghost of Rem Koolhaas, which is that there were, Rem Koolhaas has published, 8,000 books now that, each weigh 10 pounds. And he's kind of upped the ante on this issue of using data and photographs to try to build an understanding of the place. And we didn't want to copy that, or we certainly were aware that a project like this was only happening because of that precedent. But on the other hand, it's like, well, how do you make it different? And the way that we decided to make it different, actually, was to, first of all, really invest in what I would call eccentric photography, like getting the students at Art Center to work as personally as possible, so that, because our feeling was with the city of Los Angeles, again, it's very hard to draw generalities about it, and so you had to encourage individual takes. And then the other thing was to include a ton of literary excerpts. And so we had Frances Anderton, who is a local journalist, work with us, and we sort of speed read about 25 or 30 new novels written about LA in the last 5 years, and started using excerpts from them. So the book kind of opens up with this, what I call the Sopranos Opening, which is sort of driving into Los Angeles from the desert. And part of the reason we had that is that Tom had commissioned somebody to go. We drew a line on a map, and again, sort of using a very physical architect's idea of space, took a picture each quarter of a mile. And so you have this long, long sequence of photos that shows kind of traversing what the UCLA architecture students had called the agglomeration, which is sort of this big area of the, basically delineated by the mountains around the city. And then, the typography, again, kind of sits on top of images. It's a combination of a very straightforward type design and then a kind of customized, more eccentric, almost, store sign font that the students had developed. The idea is that there's a grid, but it's a wobbly grid, like this contents page, which kind of shows the book is broken up into 4 big sections of the man-made environment, the natural environment, people, and money. And that's kind of used as a matrix. But right away, even the way that the sort of grid of information is put out is a warning that you're not going to meet with a kind of regularity. And again, everything from like the issue of the sort of powers of 10 type extreme distance photos to things that are very close up onto the land. This is a typical, this is at the opening of the natural habitat section, where first we show photos of what it looks like. And again, many of the Art Center students responded with photos that were distinctly unaesthetic, which I thought was a good thing, because to me, this is what the city looks like, and no New Yorker would ever imagine that. And then shifting, for instance, then you get into a kind of delineation of the subcategories under natural habitat. And then it shifts into a kind of big introduction that's made out of basically, again, quotes, extracts from other people's writing. And then we always start again with a kind of hard data reverting to maps. Like this is the idea that actually the ecology of Los Angeles, that map on the right shows the full, it shows like the kind of a comparison of the footprint of our ecology as being as big as Peru. I mean, they're kind of very specific didactic charts, and then again, photographic sequences that just kind of illustrate, pictures of the ocean versus then the next spread is like the daily pollution rates over several years, this constant. Here's a kind of overlap of the issues of elevation in the mountains. Again, the mountains being a kind of fuzzy concept for most, even people living in LA, not realizing how big they actually are. But again, this kind of hard data then is compared with someone's words about coexisting with the mountains. This is one of my favorites because this was actually shot by one of the CalArts students who lives in Echo Park, and it's just a series of photos of the under man-made habitat that we decided to start with the nightly light show of the patrol helicopters. So there you see the go. Now, I have to say that when I started to do this project with the CalArts students, several colleagues of mine at CalArts said, I don't think you can actually do this project, thinking that it was sort of too hard or too difficult. And I certainly knew, I guess I'm confident, years of emergency production and using, in a way, digital means to get over great complex situations made me think that it was possible. But at the same time, I also think that we're in a really interesting moment in design education, and in which I think that the means are there for students to actually work at very sophisticated levels. Actually, I realized this morning I had to sign a waiver saying it was okay to be recorded. This is the one slide that if anybody wanted to sue me, they probably could. This is another one of my crackpot charts, and it's about the sort of design education and the way it's graphic design education and the way it's evolved. And quite honestly, it's totally personal because it's based on my experiences at Cranbrook in the 70s. And then I went to grad school at Yale in 1980 to 82. And then I ended up at CalArts starting in 85. And I have two columns for CalArts because 85 to 95, to me, that's pre-director, and then the program, and then 95 is post-director. And to me, director, which actually I think is 94, I might be wrong, director is really the big, it wasn't Quark that changed graphic design, it was director. But I wanted to just kind of zip through this really quickly to try to, again, contextualize the way I think design education has shifted. In the 70s, when I was a design student, again, design was totally defined as a conceptual process, with the end point not being very important, and in fact being pretty loose. Theories, we were reading, well, first of all, I would say that we were heavily under the influence of pop art, so things like Warhol. We were looking at Venturi. That whole beginning of a thing about the vernacular was a real challenge to graphic designers. People were reading Noam Chomsky, not his political stuff, but actually his stuff about language and intelligence, because there was the feeling out there that maybe graphic designers actually were dealing with language and meaning, and that had to be paid attention to. And part of the reason it was because when you went to learn typography, we were still being taught what was called Swiss design, which is basically a kind of stiff, modernist, gridded, very rule-encrusted way of doing modernist typography. So that was kind of deemed the rules, but all around us there were other examples of, much more ad hoc responses, like on my chart under the 70s, I have hippie modernism, and by that I mean things like the Whole Earth Catalog, or the whole idea of sort of simple communication being adequate enough, just again having to be thought through in an interesting way. There was no graphic design history in the 70s. If you wanted to understand design history, you had to look into architecture, but there was a kind of interest in eclecticism, in historic eclecticism, so that was there. The only technology at our hands at that point was in the darkroom. There was a very do-it-yourself attitude about creating imagery, and again, everything that you did was sort of in your studio. Okay, fine. And you go, about 6 years later, by 1981, and Yale, for better or worse, is considered to be the school of graphic design in the United States. The design was actually entirely defined as a formal process. I don't think anybody ever asked me to articulate an idea when I was in graduate school. It was simply the formal, how did I solve the formal attributes of a problem and whether or not it looked right to the faculty. And that right business was, again, actually going back to really adhering to jump to typography, the sort of Swiss. At the same time, there was this thought, and it was actually coming from the architecture school, as these things often do, that the theory was starting to be interesting. And, so they would say, well, go over to architecture. And then in architecture, they would say, well, go over to comparative literature. And there we would talk to people like Umberto Eco and all that, who try to tell us about semiotics. And so again, that sort of was an advancement from the Noam Chomsky thing, because that was very direct. Like somebody like Umberto Eco was really talking to architects and designers and trying to make them see again that design actually had a linguistic, that the understanding was counter to this notion, again, of a kind of universal perfection, but that particularity and psychology and various other, both philosophical and psychological states had a huge effect on the way people understood things. We used computers at Yale, but there was no WYSIWYG. You didn't see what you were designing on the screen, so it fostered a very distant relationship to the machine. Basically, everybody just hated them. And it was just seen as a problem, as something that separated you from your work. And again, it only kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It only emphasized a desire to kind of play by the rules because it was the easiest thing to do on that hideous equipment. And then, really, when I say the environment was corporate. I would say that the design training there, and again, the kind of good departments in the United States at that point, was sort of training people to do corporate design, again, to not necessarily understand design in a relationship to an audience, but definitely to understand design in relationship to a client. So, and that's an important piece of psychology in terms of design education. In 1985 at CalArts, we were definitely still obsessed with form, but at that point then it was like form as a, to rebel. Like how could you make it as different as possible? And that came out of a whole critique. People like myself, there were several other design faculty in the United States, if you look at it in the mid-1980s, who started writing against the sort of what I would call a kind of decline in graphic design education. And it was really, again, driven by theory, like the idea that if these things like structuralism and semiotics really mattered, then everything we were learning formally about design didn't really make sense anymore. And so, to hell with Swiss typography. There's the beginning of real interest in graphic design history, although, of course, what that brought up was all sorts of stuff out of the woodwork that people hadn't dealt with in terms of what design actually had been. You had the inclusion of the computer where you finally could see what you were doing on screen and the embrace of that, and again, changing the way people thought about their design. And I would say the period before, that early period at CalArts, when I say the environment was academic, I mean that people were so involved in these changes that I don't think we were looking at clients or audience. I think it was all about it was in the academy or the ivory tower of what we were doing there. And it's funny, this morning as I was thinking about this and whether this chart would make sense to you, I don't know, for instance, I remember I was a visitor at Cranbrook in 1991. And the week before I was there, the students said to me, oh, David Carson was just here. He was the art director of Ray Gun and Beach Culture, and in the early 90s he was God. And I remember saying, oh, so he came here to give a lecture? And they said, oh, no, he just came here to look around. And shortly after that, he was visiting our department also at Cal Arts, and you had this sense that was sort of the beginning of the shift of the alternative style into commerce. So definitely, the academic hothouse had been the place where a kind of new visual language or a new interpretation based on all of these things was kind of brewing. And then you had certain very kind of savvy art directors figuring out how to bring it into the mainstream. Finally, to look at Cal Arts now, I would say there's very interesting things going on. One is that I would say there's almost not a rejection of formal design at all, but a return back to the idea that is actually the idea in design that is important. And part of that is a kind of distrust, or not a distrust, but a kind of exhaustion, I would say, with the idea that formal novelty is going to get you everywhere. And again, I think it comes from this sort of over-marketed issue of the alternative. And theory is definitely still used, although I would say it's more of an issue in the crit room to analyze what you've done. It's not seen as being something that can generate work, which was how it was used earlier. And typography is taught in a much more inclusive way so that you look at all different ways of making typography. Graphic design history now includes media history because you can't ignore that in the environment that we work in now. Clearly, the digital has expanded to embrace time and motion, and it's not 2D or 3D, it's 4D. And then again, I would say the work is in the studio, but now it's the studio that moves around. The studio can shift location. LA Now was actually finally, in the end, designed on my dining room table by 3 people who just came every morning and opened up their laptops. You can kind of work anywhere, and I think that this sort of shift in terms of the way the studio is actually conceived is a really important one. I wanted to shift to a project that I just did, and again, I wanted to kind of talk about the reason I'm showing you this book, which was the exhibition catalog for The World from Here, the book exhibition that was at the Hammer this past fall, is that it's, to me, another it's another one of those projects that's kind of iconic and to me about the moment that we're in. Because really, what I think it caught certain things about the zeitgeist that were not intended at all in terms of the organization of the show. I mean, the show basically started with Bruce Whiteman, who's the librarian at the Clark, and Cindy Burlingham, who's here at the Grunewald, having a conversation and saying, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had a show where we pulled out, the most important books that are sitting in Los Angeles collections, public collections. And the reason that happened is that Bruce Whiteman was a new librarian and he didn't know how to use his budget for buying books. He felt like he had to understand he didn't want to duplicate other holdings because, as you know, right now books, well, I'll get back into that in a minute, but the market for antiquarian books has exploded, so everything's 10,000 times more expensive than it used to be. So it started out with this very pragmatic thing, and they put together this ludicrously large committee of like 60 different librarians to pull out the best things out of their collections. And, all sorts of stuff came out of the woodwork in doing that. There was, movie posters from the Hollywood branch of the public library and, citrus catalogs from Pomona, and very amazing things. But it still had this possibility of being this giant flea market. And, but then we got into the issue of how to organize, and that was the interesting thing in that they called both the graphic, myself as the graphic designer of the book, and then the exhibition designers in early on the project, and we were asked to help kind of figure out how you would put these books into categories, which in the end, again, in interest of an audience being able to even get their arms around the subject, we decided to pick these sort of very large subjects like literature or religion and spirituality, Los Angeles history. But when we did that, and that was one of those kind of interesting choices, what I realized is that suddenly you get into this issue of making cross comparisons because you weren't, instead of organizing it like many book shows might be organized by century or kind of basically in a chronology, but this way by subject, what it inadvertently did is it really highlighted the way books served, the way printing technology and book design served the dissemination of information in fields. And, again, I think that it was a kind of fascinating adjunct so that, because you see these things differently now. And it also kind of encouraged me in the design of this book, again, to really just highlight these things as artifacts, to reproduce them large enough to see them. Because, of course, the painful thing about book exhibitions is all those things in cases. And so if you're going to embalm a subject, at least you want to embalm it at a size that you can see it. The odd thing about this is the only argument that I had with the committee over the design of this book was the inclusion of dimensions on the book page, which I felt that it was an important thing to know how big the thing is that you're looking at. And everybody was just aghast that I wanted to clutter the pages up. But to me, again, the fascination now with books is very different. It's not just that they're beautiful old things, they are literally, they are information delivery systems, and to see them that way is very important. There's also a ton of stuff. I mean, basically this book is just one long illustrated catalog. I mean, what's called a checklist, in that there's an entry for every single book that was in the cases, but not every book, painfully, we couldn't put every book in the exhibition. So I started using this kind of silhouette system, these simple illustrator traces of the books, so that you would know, as you flip through it, you realize that when it crosses over, like that text is about the book you just saw, because the silhouette is the same. So there's an echo of the silhouettes keying you. Like here's another example. You see these two books, and then on the next page they're written about, so that's where their silhouettes are. And this is a kind of funny example of a sort of device, of trying to take a device which is current. And there's no doubt that we're kind of in the, 2001 was the year of the illustrator silhouette, but trying to make it into a functioning code in the book. But again, to me, I mean, I was fascinated. I brought both Cal Art students and some Arts Center students to see this show, and I know that 10 years ago, if you would have dragged people through a show on old books, you would have gotten like, oh, so what? And now people are like, what is this? And I think, again, it's because what you're seeing is the birth of understandings of ways of explaining information in really fascinating ways. So, this show coincided with that exhibition called Devices of Wonder at the Getty, and I thought that was a really, an inadvertent, really interesting, again, moment in terms of how we understand what is important in design's history and in media's history about the past, and that clearly it's less about the individual art making or the kind of artist vision as it is seeing these, again, as much more kind of systemic artifacts that outline a history of visual understanding. These are just more pages from, the process of this. Actually, I just threw this slide in because this was the only object that I had a fight about including, where I really wanted, the librarian. This was from your collection in the medical school. She said, oh no, we can't show this, it's ripped, it's taped. It's like, this is the first publication of the genetic code. Who cares that it's taped? But again, that's exactly the opposite. Generally, in the past, it would have been the graphic designer saying, oh no, it's taped, I don't want that. Whereas I'm like, it's taped, who cares? And this segue, this is my other little digression about the fact that, clearly we're in a period where the new technologies are highlighting the old ones. That, again, if you look at the publishing right now about books, there's a tremendous explosion of material about publishing looking at every aspect of the book, and that, and like I mentioned, there's been an explosion in the market of antiquarian books and in the interest in publishing, and one giant Barnes & Noble being built after another at the very stage we're at when people were forecasting that new media was going to kill the book. I mean, it's clearly, but clearly it's new media that's causing this kind of re-examination of where books can go, and what is possible in them. And I think there's definitely the general feeling is that we're in a period where I think that that the new media has actually only made print design more interesting. I just wanted to show a couple things. In fact, I think I'm going to. Can somebody tell me the time, because I don't want to drive it. Okay, I'm going to cut this short. I just wanted to show two books. This is an old book from maybe '96 or something that I did with Hodgetts and Fung in Los Angeles, which I have to say is one of those books that truly illustrates the way that new media affected book design, or the conceptualization of how a book would work. Like, this book is essentially about 6 projects. And each project you open up with kind of a big explanation of what the project is, the plan diagrams, the plan models, some perspectives. But then as you get into it, suddenly along the bottom of the book starts to shuttle a kind of pop-up section of footnotes where we relate other projects, realized and unrealized, that they had done in their past to the major narrative that you're looking at. So there's a kind of double narrative, and again, that kind of ability to ingest information in this complex way, I think, comes from getting used to reading on the screen, or the multiple windows, the sort of setup. At the same time, there are things, just because you're stabilizing the movement, there are certain things that you can do in print that are still just obviously genetically different than the screen, but the interrelationship has been incredibly rich. The other thing I wanted to show is this book by Uta Barth, on Uta Barth's photography. I designed this along with a designer named Michael Worthington. Uta Barth's photography, if you're familiar with it, is this very subtle work that plays with the idea of focus. And she works at all kinds of different scales. And the other designer and I decided, and this is where this issue, of audience and consciousness of how do you state the problem, we wanted to design this book to have the reader understand what it's like to see Uta Barth's photography. And of course, that means actually relatively up close and recognize, and not necessarily seeing the edges of it. We wanted to get at the physical sensation of looking at her work. And to us, that meant actually showing details so that you could understand that even in the detail, this focus was so, kind of subtly pushed out. Of course, and we also wanted to interrelate the kinds of details that she makes. Now, of course, this isn't her idea. Her idea is this, which is basically, I can say, 8 out of 10 artists want their work on a white page with nothing else on it and a frame. And so what we came up with was a compromise that basically every time we detailed a photograph to show you what it felt to look like, we would then repeat it so that you could kind of see it properly with its edges. So we sort of served the museum mechanism of the proper documentation of work, and then but then we still satisfied our desire to document the experience, and we kind of used that again as things like divider pages and whatever. Here again you see a big detail. Within a few pages after that, you would see the work in its proper variation. And then now this one is backwards. The only place that you actually can really understand the issue of scale is on the pages where we essentially put the checklist, where you see the things in position with some kind of device like a viewer to show you what the size of the thing you're actually looking at. But essentially every time we showed a detail, it was one-to-one. I had this whiz-bang closing, but I'm afraid of going on too long. The whiz-bang, and it's on the other slide tray, and I don't even want to go there. Except to say that I think that I've tried in this talk to kind of raise these issues, again, of the interrelationship of the process, which to me is always about your consciousness of stating the problem and of how you kind of pinpoint who the audience is for your work. And then, of course, relating your work to the bigger culture. And then, of course, the ways we make the work. And again, that kind of issue that is much harder to talk about. Really, you think? Okay, I'm just worried about, okay. Okay, well, I will try to talk quickly.
We don't want to miss the...
Okay. This is a book for Charles Ray, who I think is on the art faculty here. Oh, yeah. Actually, this is a completely fake cover. You know, again, this, you know, he is standing in front of an Anthony Caro that he never stood next to. You know, it's a sort of slick digital rendering, but of course with him wearing clothes that he has carefully reconstructed to look exactly like clothes you would buy at the Gap. But when I started to do this book with Charles Ray for MoCA, I looked at the other books on his work, and the thing that just astonished me, given that what he works with is this sort of, I mean, he was really playing mental games with your whole, you know, your senses of perspective, to me, or perspective or scale are the things that he uses to kind of screw up the way that you understand the sort of veracity of your environment. And it just astonished me that all his books were small. Like none of them were bigger than this. And so, you know, in some ways, the first thing I felt that I did for this project that was useful was said, well, we're going to make a really big book. So it's like 11 by 14, and it's not very thick, but it's got, and this is again where the craft issue comes in. You know, I realized that it just had to be heavy. It was thin and big, but it had to really weigh a ton. So we just made, you know, the binding boards are just a little too heavy. You know, and again, thanks to a good German binder who really knows how to do it. It's just made very, very beautifully, but it's too big. It's kind of an uncomfortable book to open. And then you know, open up and you see these sort of, again, these are those mannequins that he's done that are, I think, 20% too big. You know, so again, the scale is very uncomfortable. They're scaled on the page to look like they're kind of just about to, you know, they just hit the trim. Very, again, hard to manipulate it to get it that right. We also did something where all the, you know, there's a kind of digital retouching to take every speck out of the walls. In fact, half of these things were shot in galleries that had moldings. All the moldings are taken out. Like anything that would indicate, that give you a scale indicator, we actually took out to make to make it feel more eerie. You know, and again, this is about a sort of delicate visual manipulation. Things like this, like putting the blank on the wrong side. You know, book convention says you look on the right first. So, you know, here we just simply play with that convention of a kind of void in the wrong place. This is, to me, this is his iconic piece. It's where, you know, a nuclear family where everybody has been rendered at exactly the same scale so that the adults are brought down 20% and the children are enlarged, which is such a sick idea. But, you know, again, this is kind of the centerpiece. You get to this and it defines that. And then when you actually get into the design of the book, you know, this was simple in that the text block, as plain as it is and as ordinary as it is way too small for that book page. So, you know, again, and you have the sense, you know, that what's called the running head, you know, the name of the author of the essay, and then the folio, you know, the page number is embracing that a book page, which in a way doesn't belong there. It's too small. So that kind of sense of dislocation is worked through. Oh, this is where the other tray. Oh, yeah. There's just about 20 more slides. And these things, like both the Uta Barth book and the Charles Ray book, are projects where the collaboration is very intense. I mean, it's literally day to day.
What that collaborative process is like?
Well, you know, it so depends on the artist because first of all, I mean, just in a very personal way, one of my experiences, it's getting better partially because of, most of the times I'm actually hired by a curator, although now sometimes artists will ask if they can work with me, but I'm hired by a curator. Well, the curator is sort of saying to the artist, don't worry, she won't fuck you over, basically. And then I go in and say, okay, I'm not going to do anything bad to your work, I promise. But to me, again, I think once it's understood that actually, and I think this is true of both the Uta Barth book and the Charles Ray book very much, I'm not doing anything that's stylistically bizarre, but I am working skeletally. You know, that everything is about the structure underneath. And actually, everything to me, when I'm doing one of those books, my goal is so that the reader who picks up that book really understands that work. That's my main goal, and once the artist gets with that, like Charles Ray, I think, was fine with that, although it amazed me, but the business about the page numbers in the wrong place in the book, we spent about a day in my studio moving page numbers around. At the end of it, it was like, oh my God. I mean, he kind of got it too well. But it has to do with, you know, again, his interest in minutia at that issue of scale again, and understanding that it had to be absolutely, it couldn't be too blatant, it couldn't be so subtle that nobody saw it. But, you know, usually I would say the collaboration works once people understand I'm not going to do something funny to them.
So you are managing, and you prefer, I imagine, to work with the artist directly rather than have the curator?
Yeah, most of the time, definitely. Yeah, because curators often have their own agenda that is not necessarily what the artist is interested in. And in fact, I'm working on something right now that's a huge morass, where the artist and the curator are really at odds. And
who is the artist right now?
a video artist from Israel named Michal Rovner. She does large-scale sort of environmental installations. And, you know, again, I'm working on trying to replicate the feeling of being in an installation. That part is fine, but then when it comes to, like, the way that the curator has written an essay and, you know, like, for instance, just for many artists, this is a really common thing. You know, a curator will say, well, I want to write about your work chronologically. Well, if you do that, that means the work in the front of the book is their oldest work. And that drives a lot of people nuts. In fact, that's usually the first big problem that we have to deal with is like, how is this editorially really going to be organized? So there are kind of questions about editorial, again, a kind of integrity before you even get to what the thing's going to look like. So that's what I mean about structure, you know, working structurally. Actually, I'm finishing the two last books I want to show you are pure, what I would call visual narratives that I think are really, you know, in a way, the media that's driving the design of these books is film and not necessarily any of the things that are more like motion graphics or things like that. This was a book I did for the Whitney Museum a few years ago for a show that they had on the period of 1950 to 65 when the sort of beatniks were having an influence on film and literature and art making. And in truth, there's an amazing trove of photographs. You know, when we did this book, we had more photographs than we could use. And in fact, the way that I designed this book was I laid it out visually, literally, with a set of photographic comparisons as a visual essay first, and then we figured out, I mean, with some knowledge of what kind of writing was coming, but how to interrelate those things. But it really starts out, you know, and I have to say again that it sounds easy, but it isn't. Like, for instance, one of the problems in working visually now, and I think this is true in any media, is that you know, there's incredible legal control over images now, and that actually ends up infecting the way you design things. Like, for instance, there was one photographer a living photographer who we had to use many of his photos because they were too important not to. And yet he had a rule in his contract that stipulated you could not bleed his photos to the edge of a page. Now, I mean, again, it sounds stupid, and it is stupid, but there it is in the contract with an angry photographer, you know, who at some point, you know, or another had somebody take one of his photos and chop it badly, and so therefore everybody in perpetuity has to suffer. You know, there are also contracts, photographers' contracts, or estates, like Marcel Duchamp. You can't print one of Marcel Duchamp's photographs in a colored ink. On his estate stipulates that if it's a black and white photo, it can't be printed in red ink. You know, it's like, but it wasn't, it's a black and white photo. Anyway, so you have to deal, this is a kind of cloud hanging over these sorts of books that, that is just part of, again, a complexity of working. But I did notice as I had gotten this huge pile of photographs, there were these amazing portraits. And given that the whole book is kind of a soap opera anyway, in terms of the way that the beats, the history of the beats anyway, I decided that we would open it with a kind of sequence of these portraits. And it's all various. I'm just showing you a few of the pages from it, but it just kind of goes on and on, these kind of a sort of wordless gallery at the beginning of the book to set the tone of the major players. It's funny because it's become a kind of trope of book design now. It's very common to have these long intros before you hit the title page. But at that point, it was still kind of an underused strategy. Again, there's a kind of, we actually designed the font by taking, I don't know, like News Gothic or something, and running a photograph under it and then making a new photographer font so that we had this sort of broken type, which, you know, it's true now that I look at this, when we did this, the sort of decayed typography was cool. But again, I think there's a relationship, again, to the sense of, in the book itself, of a sort of veracity. But you have these very, again, strong contrasts of this sort of journal, almost movie still type photography. Again, with a pretty simplified text layout. These are all, the curator did an amazing job in pulling related images and news stills that we were able to pull into them. Things like this, like the kind of Hollywood movie set nuclear family versus a sort of beatnik family from San Francisco. You know, we just had that in this huge pile. So I would find these things and we would kind of design around them. A beatnik boy interior decorating, my favorite pages in there. And then when you got actually into the essays, again, there was a kind of really tight relationship between the images and the text, and also kind of narratives that you could make, you know, these amazing contrasts, or, you know, that happened visually first, and then, you know, like to me, this sort of photo of the kind of Ginsberg wailing versus this very pensive and dignified Charlie Parker image is, you know, it was those kind of contrasts that all through the book we could set up these sort of, not, I wouldn't call them editorials, but these sort of amazing visual comparisons. And then finally, in the end, the Whitney had gone through the trouble of hiring this, oh God, his name escapes me now, this like art researcher who managed to map out the love lives of these people in the collaborative map. And so then I asked Ed, you know, Ed Fella, my favorite beatnik, to actually render it into, so it's information designed by Ed Fella of these kind of wacky, mapping the community. I wanted to end with this totally frivolous project. On top of everything else, of course, after you design books a lot, you finally decide that you want to be a publisher. And I have two friends here in Los Angeles that we scrape together the funds to put out a couple books a year. And this was one that we put out last year that has turned into a huge hit and now is almost out of print. called Height of Fashion, and what Height of the imprint is called Grable. You can check out our website. And Height of Fashion, what it is we sent letters to about 400 or 500 people that we knew, and in the letter we said, you know, send us a photograph of yourself at the point in your life when you thought you looked the best. And we got, you know, there were about, I would say about 10% of the people we sent thought we were jackasses and didn't get it. And it took months, like our first deadline, we only had about 40 pictures, and we thought, okay, this idea didn't work. And then suddenly we got a flood. And we got a flood of the most amazing images, and it turns out it's kind of a, you know, it's a kind of not an anti-fashion document, but it is a document about the way people manipulate their own look and what it means. And we got a lot of kids photographs, which obviously are a lot of people saying, you know, I didn't look good as an adult, I only looked good when I was a child. We also got, like, if people we sent the letters to were in their 40s, they sent us pictures of the 70s. And if people were in their 30s, they sent pictures of the 80s. So there's a lot of very odd 70s and 80s photographs. And then it was my job to figure out a way of putting them together. And so basically I kind of put them together where you kind of map out a set of relationships of childhood and childhood dreams, and then into dating, and then into marriage, and then finally into old age and death. But because we actually got some photos like that as well, which was amazing. Like that, I don't know if anybody knows Noreen Morioka. She's an important graphic designer here in LA. That's her in her cowboy outfit. And then somebody who's a rodeo star. These are from the early parts of the book. Actually, Jeff Ketty, the typographer, is on the Tony the Tiger bicycle. Like this is a photograph, the photograph on the right, I went into my neighbor's kitchen one day and that was hanging on her refrigerator because her husband had pulled it out and was jeering at her for her boyfriend. It's like we also asked people to just give us little lines of how they felt. And so it's a kind of narrative of people, you know, looking back on how they looked at the time. This is a pair of brother and sister from Bel Air, of course. I love that one. These people don't know each other, but they should have. That was the other wonderful thing, was sort of fantasy relationships. Here's the 80s. Again, the kind of interesting time shifts, and then finally, actually Dennis Hopper sent us this photo for when he looked his best as a drugged out hippie behind John Ford. That, I think, is our final image in the book. Yes, here I was ending with Ed Fella's poster. Ed is somebody I've known since I was a teenager, and he's been like a major mentor to me. And this poster with his weird poetic text, finger on exactly identifying that meddlesome art touch in the design pie, to me again signifies, you know, that sort of, as I said, the kind of part of any design that you can't really quantify very well at all. And then finally, I wanted to end with my favorite piece of design direction from Sister Carita. For the students in the audience, I just thought the last part of this, helpful hints, go to everything, always go to class, read anything you get your hands on, look at movies carefully, often, save everything, it might come in handy later, is the words of wisdom. Thank you.
You brought up...
Can I sit? I'm going to just pull a chair over here.
Please do. I guess I'll collapse the series of questions because what I noticed in your talk is there was a kind of a dichotomy that kept coming up. And I have a feeling it's very conscious in your work when you're dealing with content versus context, and design in relation to audience versus design in relation to client, and then process and product. And the way I would like to frame this question is in relation to history or lack of. We have a professor here who actually specializes in media arts, history of. Erki Hukkama is not here, he's out of town today, but he was planning to do a class that was covering also the history of design, and was actually shocked at the lack of books, and he's a real scholar that can go through that. So can you talk a little bit about those dichotomies in relation to the lack of the history and how they may have affected that to actually happen?
Well, you know, I mean, it's an interesting thing because I've been teaching, you know, I teach graphic design history at CalArts, although it's a more generalized course than that. And the truth is, you still can't actually order a book. You know, there's no really good, I mean, there's a kind of standard text that a lot of people use that's deeply flawed. But the deeper issue is the difficulty, I think, of drawing up a history of what is both, you know, weirdly enough, too ephemeral, too common, you know, too expansive, actually. I mean, there is a contradiction in that. Like, on one hand, that, you know, you realize that the archives that exist for design history are just this tiny crust of what actually constituted all the given, you know, design at one moment. Or even if you look at, you know, if you go to, say, you want to see what people were doing in the 40s that was important, well, still the only documents are already so highly edited that I think the best you can do, you know, so people have been hobbled by this almost impossibility of cataloging the actual work. So as a result, there have been different kind of narratives, you know, and there's the sort of master narrative, you know, just like in everything else, there's, you know, the sort of procession of inspired guys narrative of design history, you know, that actually kind of jumps around quite a bit. It's very selective. I don't know how lengthy I should make this, but just to talk a little bit about my own history. When I was a design student, for instance, it was just when, in the 1970s, when books in English about Russian constructivism started appearing. Like, there were early translations of books in Russian, and like finally that book by Sophie Lizitsky came out. Things like that, which of course students immediately glommed onto. Like, here was finally some information. And so I had this story in my head about this, you know, again, this incredible period of great creativity and invention in, you know, of all places, Moscow in 1917. And then, if you followed Swiss typography, then you were taught, well, then the Swiss, you know, Jan Schickold and the Swiss designers took this and essentially adapted it and modernized it, you know, in a way, civilized it for greater, you know, greater consumption. So there was this direct, like, even if you look at books from the 1970s about Swiss typography, they always cite the modernists, you know, the avant-garde. You know, you'll see reproductions of Elizitsky, of Rodchenko, people like that, as their forebears. Well, you know, I'm sitting in Detroit, you know, looking at this stuff in my early 20s, and I would ask my, you know, the McCoys, my teachers, well, so what happened here? And they would say, oh, nothing, it was all horrible. And you don't look at it, it's just awful. And actually, after I got out of Cranbrook, I started working in New York, and I started going to the New York Public Library, and one of the reasons I did is I would just go and I would check out like American magazines. I would say, well, show me 10 years of Esquire from 1935 to 1945, because that was literally the only way that I could construct an understanding of what American design looked like at that point. And actually what I realized then was that it was the period where Americans actually were picking, well, first of all, there'd been this flood of emigration of modernist designers who came to the US in the 30s, out of Germany, mostly out of Germany, but out of Russia as well. And they came and they started working commercially, and actually they quickly got everybody's attention. If you look at the art directors' annuals from that period, you see Herbert Bayer winning prizes, all that stuff, click, click, click. And then you have Americans beginning to emulate it, and then, it turns into something else because it wasn't as codified formally as it had been in Europe by the Swiss. But it's true, it looks messy, but it's kind of more interesting. It's more interesting conceptually because clearly there was this issue of translating ideas. And actually the whole reason I went to Yale at all, I would never have gone there, I think, other than the fact that I realized at a certain point that a whole bunch of faculty who were there had actually been working during that period. So I thought, I'll go there and I'll study with these guys and I'll learn this secret stuff that nobody knows. Of course, what I didn't realize until I got there is that, of course, they were not, being true modernists, they were not interested in history at all. And in fact, if I talked to them, like every time I'd meet with Paul Rand and I'd say, I want to talk to you about your work, he'd say, talk about Belozitsky. It's like, well, I can't read Russian. You're here. Can I talk about you? No. So there's this battle about it. So I was one of the people, I wrote a whole thesis about American design during that period. It got published, then there was a lot of writing after that. But then, actually, I have to say, I completely lost interest in design history at that point, in writing more. And it was because I saw it turn into this issue of a pantheon of heroes.
What?
A kind of pantheon of heroes. In fact, one of the first published books on this generation is called 9 Pioneers of Graphic Design. And to me, the issue that was more interesting was that there was a commercial audience there that was ready to accept a kind of new visual language, that you can't ignore that it's around the same time as people are beginning to talk about television, the proliferation of more people seeing movies, that there clearly is a lot more going on. But at least in the graphic design world, there has been so much worry about their own legitimacy as designers that there's been this rush to lionize individuals, and which is why when you go to look at the books, they seem so paltry, because basically we're still at a stage where the people writing mostly about design are still essentially publishing portfolios of work by individuals that undoubtedly were important people, but not for the reasons that we think.
And do you think that's because of the problem with audience versus client?
To some degree, yes. Yeah, I think that's, and again, because it's so much harder, there's so little to measure. There are a few people who've tried to understand in a deeper way, even projects in history. You can see a kind of evolution of thinking about it. For instance, is, I think the Museum of Modern Art in the middle of World War II commissioned a bunch of graphic designers in New York to do propaganda posters. Well, if you look in a lot of graphic design history books, you see those things reproduced. And you think, oh, Leo Leone did this cool propaganda poster. Well, now, there's this one sort of muckraking historian at the University of Chicago who published something recently that pointed out that those were prototypes that were never published. So that to even reproduce them, that this is a critical piece of information, that they never went beyond the walls of the Museum of Modern Art. They were not published as posters. So then you know, isn't a more interesting question, why weren't they? Or how did they work differently than the ones that actually were? What, you know, there's a lot more to say about that. But that's, I think, still another generation of writers who have to get into it. And I mean, when I say that I personally lost interest, part of it was that I felt definitely, you know, when I taught in Texas, I had no access to any archives at all of any depth, so I couldn't keep working on it. And then I also realized, I guess once I started teaching, that the real story in graphic design was the story that was going on in the present. Like, to me, history is vital. I can't even think of my own work without it. But at the same time, the last 15 years of graphic design history have been just as critical and you know, vivid and worthy of kind of writing and thinking and documentation than the past. And when I was doing historical research, I realized that one of the rarest things you would ever encounter was a designer writing about the present. You know, there were a few who wrote about the experience of working in 1945, and when you hit those documents, you'd say, oh. And so that's when I decided if I did any more writing, it would be about now. And that's when you look at the list of writings, everything is a kind of documenting of what it's been like to teach since 1985.
I would like to ask you something.
I'm very, very impressed with what I've seen. I'm
Thank
extremely
you.
impressed. I'm wondering if I see, let's say, rich design activities in different urban environments, I mean active urban environments, what people are mass producing, young people, like all these flyers for clubs and stuff like that, which are in a way not necessarily, I mean, who wants to compare them in terms of quality, are they amazing? But it is a language, it creates it unfolds a language in graphics design, which somebody like you, of course, can't cover and would be stupid to cover it in the own work. But how is your experience dealing from the perspective of a teacher, of a professor, with these, let's say, desires for visual language of younger generations? How are you dealing with this?
Well, I mean, as a designer, of course, you know, it's part of the sea I'm swimming in. So it's very, you know, I look at everything, and you know, I certainly have the piles of paper in my studio to prove it. In terms of, you know, and of course, and I'm from the generation who's accepted the fact that that work is in a continuum, and that there isn't a high and a low and a place where one shouldn't tread. And in fact, you know, there's definitely, I mean, even like the world from here, I mean, when I said the silhouettes are going to be like the illustrator of 2001, there was a kind of funny thing this year where a Cal Arts student made a little 10-minute, not 10 minutes, sorry, 1 minute video piece called Let's Kill the Silhouettes that was all done. You know, he'd done these little illustrator works and then animated it, and it was like of the sights of a gun shooting down all the kind of illustrator silhouette images. And, you know, it's because of, again, the proliferation. It's part of that proliferation cycle where people get sick of things really quickly. And just at the point, I had to laugh just at the point where I'd figured out how to make one function as something, you know, I had this like kid saying, oh God, it's so over, you know, I can't stand it. And so, you know, I think that those interrelationships are really fascinating, again, to see it as part of a cycle of things. The cycle is insanely accelerated right now. And in fact, even if you look, like I remember going to London a few years ago and seeing the club flyers and being really amazed by them. Well, now if you walk into Hennessy and Ingalls, there are at least 45 books by designers that all look identical and they all look like the club flyers. And all you know is that it's played itself out and somebody will come along and invent something more interesting to look at. But, you know, again, the cycle is so different now. because, you know, certainly what you did used to see was more like funkier, more localized phenomenon graphically, but now the network is so open that anything can get replicated anywhere. So, but it becomes a discussion with students, because when you choose to either use it or not, whether you choose to use something or not, there's a reason. And it's always where you are in position to that as part of the environment in the context that you work in.
More and more students are doing works across different kinds of technologies.
Yeah.
So they might make a print work, which also is a website, which also becomes an object or whatever. Can you talk about how have you been dealing, for example, you talked about Director. Do you also teach Director or web-based?
I don't teach any programs, but we do. I mean, in the curriculum that I've been working on now for 15 years at CalArts, I mean, definitely the big shift in the last 5 years has been to completely to integrate the practices. You know, for instance, I think it's in second year undergrad at CalArts where there's a deliberate, you know, you solve a problem one way for print, you take the same problem, how do you deal with it differently in electronic media? And that's to really build an understanding that they're not the same animal, that it's not just taking the same graphic motif and plunking it over into a different environment, that there are a whole set of opennesses. There are sets of capabilities coming out of, for instance, using the internet to generate content or to generate environments that are different. And so, you know, we went from a phase, I think, of trying to separate it and then realizing earlier and earlier that we had to just confront it as always, you know, as being there all the time. And it's really because, I mean, everybody training now to be a designer, that's going to be that's the way they will be working. I mean, I've consulted on websites connected to work projects that I've done in print, partially because of just the load of what I do in terms of print design and writing and teaching. I haven't gone that heavily in my own practice into digital work, but it certainly has been a huge issue in teaching and in curriculum development.
This is, I guess, a two-part question. Where do you see graphic design going, and where would you like to see graphic design go in terms of exploration, experimentation?
Well, it's, you know, I think that part of the reason I think that graphic design is a really interesting thing to study right now is precisely because the definition of design practice is really, I think, shifting. And it's not, to put it kind of grossly, there was a whole period, say up to maybe the early 90s, where a lot of professional graphic design practice was literally kind of like police work.
Like what?
Police work. You know, it was keeping the peace. You know, it was establishing formats and policing them. American graphic designers in particular made huge buckets of money doing, say, corporate identities and policing them. You know, making sure, you know, that they were implemented correctly and charging by the nanosecond for that work. That is just not the case anymore. Companies, you know, after the various recessions, kind of companies wised up and stopped all that. The capabilities of generating work have become cheaper. And so that kind of work is actually not, I mean, when you look at the configuration, even in just the period that I've lived in LA, the configuration of offices has really shifted. There are much fewer big offices. There are many more small practices. And I think the small practices have more, you know, the good ones, again, are based on designers being consulted at the conceptual level for ideas, and whether it's, you know, people like me kind of working in the institutional or educational world, or it's people who do brand, you know, consult on brand identities, or, you know, the kind of more corporate problems that engage a sort of visual communication. And actually, I think there are still areas like education, and I mean K through 12, that are huge gaping opportunities for designers to get involved in. Again, in both media, well, in multimedias. You know, that graphic designers have to be much smarter now, because there isn't this ready-made pile of assignments that there used to be. So it's vaguer, and in fact pessimists, which I don't want to name, there are several pessimists who claim that graphic design is over, or that the profession is over, that there isn't, you know, that there's just, it's too dispersed, that there's a kind of hierarchy of authority that has literally been destroyed by the onset of new media, and it just doesn't matter anymore. Well, I don't believe that. I think all the problems are still there. It's just the structure to support that kind of old-fashioned hierarchy isn't there. So, you know, again, like to look at the LA Now thing. You know, that was a book, I think the total budget on that book, and that book is hundreds and hundreds of pages, was less than $100,000. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, but actually, if you would have compared to doing that project 15 years ago, you would have needed $300,000 or $400,000 to do that. You know, that was, again, done on a bunch of laptops. You know, the possibilities, or my own experience with Little Grable Press, the possibilities are out there for all kinds of working that have to be more entrepreneurial and more situational and strategic. And that's where I see graphic design going. I just don't see it in the old-fashioned sense of the big corporate consultants, you know, continuing to thrive. But part of that, too, of course, is the view. It's easy to say in 2002 with another recession that's making, you know, all the offices that did exist lay people off. So. Thank you. Thank you for sitting out lunch hour.